So during Taft's presidency, there were a lot of people in his own party that were very unhappy with him. They, of course, went to Roosevelt and asked him to come back and save the progressive movement in the Republican Party, and Roosevelt will. 1910, he will come back to the United States from his trip around Europe, and he will start openly talking about the government doing more and moving in a more progressive direction. He will eventually call this New Nationalism. So by 1910, he's giving speeches calling for what he called New Nationalism, which essentially is just more federal government to deal with the problems of industrialization and urbanization in all areas of life. This, I know, implies a policy of a far more active governmental interference with social and economic conditions in this country than we have yet had, but I think we have got to face the fact that such an increase in government control is now necessary. So he is calling for a whole different form of government, or the government acting in a totally different way. And it was very obvious he is sort of campaigning for the Republican nomination. Taft, for his part, tried to basically plead with Roosevelt, sent him a letter saying, I've done everything I could, but I'm afraid I haven't been able to maintain your status or policies as president. Roosevelt, at first, was willing to listen, but very quickly he made it clear that he was going to challenge Taft for the nomination. By 1911, he was openly criticizing Taft. One speech, he said, Taft has sold the square deal down the river. He is a hopeless fathead. It's a direct quote. And by 1912, he said openly, I am going to put my hat in the ring. My hat is in the ring. I am going to run for president. So now, the Republican Party has two candidates. You have the incumbent, William Howard Taft, and his former friend and the person who got him to be president, Roosevelt. To make a very complicated story very short, what we have now, primaries, where in every state the population gets to pick who they want to be the candidate for their party, that did not exist before. Before, it was state conventions. And during this period where we're having the progressive era, when we have reforms in all aspects, that is one of the reforms, is moving to this primary system we have today. But at the time, it was kind of split. The states were split, whether they had primaries, which is more democratic than we have today, versus state conventions, which then is controlled by like the rich and the powerful. Half of the states, almost half the states were one of each, and the states that were all controlled by the convention supported Taft. The states that were controlled by primaries supported Roosevelt. So when it got to the convention, there were literal fistfights. People were so angry on which candidate was going to be in charge that it broke down into pandemonium, and ultimately, the Republican Party was more controlled by old school Republicans, laissez-faire Republicans, that preferred Taft to Roosevelt. So Taft ended up getting the nomination. As you would expect, Roosevelt didn't take this well. So he and his supporters were so angry, they got up and they bolted out of the convention. And they will form the most successful third party in all of U.S. history, the Bull Moose Party. It's the Progressive Party. They were called the Bull Moose Party. Now Roosevelt, he's a good politician. He knows he's splitting the Republican Party. What he's hoping for is to get all of the progressive Republicans and then get the progressive Democrats to support him. Because right now you just have the Republican Party split, which means obviously the Democrats are going to win the election. What the progressives will call for is new nationalism, and this is really important to understand. I will not ask you for the specifics about new nationalism, but you must understand basic idea is more government in virtually all aspects of society to create a more equitable and fair system. Now, a lot of people, when they hear more government, they immediately think, oh, that's all terrible and I hate it all. Well, let me tell you what it was first. So we talked about the Omaha Platform and how that was the blueprint for reform for years to come. The Progressive Party's platform, New Nationalism, it will be the blueprint for years to come. So we essentially passed most of the Omaha Platform. New Nationalism will be the blueprint for years to come, and most of it will be passed. In terms of social justice, this is protecting individuals. Social justice means a welfare system, basic welfare system. When you hear welfare, most people think the government giving people out money, but no, that is the government looking out for the basic welfare of its citizens. And so this is using the government to protect individuals. Some of the major planks, social justice planks, of the Progressive Party platform will be stuff like prohibiting child labor, or labor under the age of 14, minimum wage for women, prohibition of night work, and 8-hour workdays for women and young people, getting 1 day in rest in 7, workers' compensation, protection of home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through the adoption of a system of social insurance adapted to American use. That is Social Security. Well, we obviously get that in 1935, but Social Security has 3 parts. And so the things he's calling for, though, some of these things, minimum wage, prohibition of child labor, 8-hour workdays, we don't get to that till 1938. So none of these things today are what we would call radical. Workers' compensation, if you get injured on the job, you should have be compensated for it. None of these are considered radical by today's standards, but for the time they were. So in terms of social justice, it's calling for the government to enact legislation to protect individuals. Political reforms, women's suffrage, or women's right to vote, nationwide presidential primaries, that is a more democratic system in every state. Secret ballots. There are some places where when you voted, like you don't have, it's not in secret. Everyone can see exactly who you're voting for. Registration of lobbyists, none of those are particularly radical. And when it came to the federal government and big business, New Nationalism called for just a larger government. We therefore demand a strong national regulation of interstate corporations, calling for regulatory agencies to regulate all big business. Well, at least the problems of big business. So it is calling for the government to reform all aspects of society. And remember, when I say big government, people have a natural knee-jerk reaction, good, bad, but everything I've just mentioned, as a generalization, most people think that they are good things, and all of it will eventually pass. It takes decades, but that's why this is the blueprint for reform. So the Republicans' animal is the elephant, the Democrats is the donkey. Why exactly are the progressives the bull moose? You don't have to know this, but it's just a really good story. They're called the Bull Moose Party because of an event that happened when Roosevelt was traveling throughout the country giving speeches. He was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, about to give a big speech in front of a huge auditorium. He didn't realize that there was someone following him. It was a bar owner named John Schrank, who had been following him since New Orleans. As Roosevelt is walking to give his speech, Schrank comes out with a gun, aims it, fires it, point blank range. Roosevelt had a 50-page speech and also his eyeglass case tucked away in his vest, and the bullet goes through those, so they slowed down the bullet, and it lodged in his in his ribs, right below his lungs. Roosevelt, first people descended on the guy and started beating him to death. Roosevelt said, "Stop, do not hurt him. The legal system will take care of him." And then Roosevelt took a few deep breaths, realized he wasn't coughing up blood wasn't spraying out, which meant he hadn't been hit in the lungs. So everyone around him said, "Quick, you need to go to the hospital." He said, "Okay, let me just go tell everyone what happened, and then I'll go to the hospital." So he walked into this giant stadium, and he said, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. The bullet is in me now, so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." And then he goes on to make an 1.5-hour speech with blood coming out of the side of him. The crowd is going absolutely wild. Afterwards, he goes to the hospital, and the doctors determined that it's more dangerous to take the bullet out than to leave it in. So he will keep that bullet in him from 1912 till his death in 1919. As far as the shooter, John Schrank, when asked, why did you do it? Schrank said, "Oh, I have nothing against Roosevelt. I actually like Roosevelt. But the ghost of William McKinley told me I had to shoot him as a warning to every third termer." Because Roosevelt had already served 2 terms, so this would be his 3rd term if he won. So long story short, Schrank was out of his mind. Spent the next 27 years until his death in jail. But that is how the Republicans became the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressives became the Bull Moose Party. So now we have the Republicans under Taft. We have a third party, the Progressive Party. And so the Democrats, they were in great position. This will bring onto the scene Woodrow Wilson. Usually, when you hear people that don't know anything about the Progressive Party, or the Progressive era, they always attribute all of it to Woodrow Wilson. And he is a major part of it. But he is not the entire thing. Wilson, a little bit of background. He was born in the South. He was an all-out Southerner. He then went on to get he got his bachelor's at the University of Virginia. Then he got a law degree at Princeton. Like Roosevelt, he realized he didn't want to do law. He wanted to be an academic. So he went back, got a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. And then he will be a college history professor at Princeton. And he did such a good job, he was made president of Princeton in 1910, president of Princeton. And then in 1910, he did such a good job at that, he was made governor of New Jersey. And he was did such a good job as governor of New Jersey from 1910 to 1912 that the Democrats will nominate him for their candidate. Now, it took a while. It took like 40, at the Democratic convention, it took a while because Democrats are notoriously bad at politics to this day. But he ended up getting the nomination. And there's a couple things to know about him. One, he was son of Presbyterian ministers, and he was intensely religious. Because of that, he always talked about the way things should be, the way they ought to be. He was very moralistic. And because he was very moralistic, because he always talked about the way things should and ought to be, he was terrible at compromising. And this will be important later when we get to World War I. The other thing that's important to know about him is he was intensely Southern. So he was very conservative like Roosevelt, but he was conservative in that he didn't like radicalism. He hated populists like Roosevelt, and he hated socialists like Roosevelt. But he also hated labor unions, and he hated big business. So he is a Southern conservative. And he will call for new freedom. Now, new freedom is the idea that what the country needs is to break up all these corporations and have a bunch of small companies that are so small that there's increased competition. So he will promote the antitrust idea of what is the relationship between the federal government and big business. He says the federal government should be expanded just enough to break up all the corporations so there's increased competition, and that way we'll only have small units, and basically we'll go back to the world the way it was before the second industrial revolution. He always talked about the past like it's wonderful. He's very, very Southern way to think of things. So this is a very Southern form of progressivism. It is progressivism, but it's a backward-looking progressivism, going back to the period before the second industrial revolution. So the three things that he will call for with New Freedom. First, lower the tariff. Because if you lower the tariff, that is obviously tariffs meant to help business. And this is just a very Southern Democrat thing. They've been calling for this for, since the 1810s. So it's a very Southern Democrat thing. Lower the tariff first. Second, strengthen the antitrust laws. And third, create a new banking and monetary system. The banking and monetary system in the United States was absolute garbage, and it had been since Jackson killed the second bank of the United States. He said with these three things, it will create a more equitable system all throughout the country, and then there will be increased competition, and so that will solve all problems. He specifically said there is no point in passing legislation like a minimum wage, prohibiting child labor, because if there's more competition, that will solve all these problems. It's an idea that some people have to this day, that just with increased competitions, us consumers will only buy from companies that treat their workers well, and so it'll put the other ones out of business, so they'll all treat their workers well. That's the idea behind increased competition. So he is a form of progressive, but obviously a very different kind of progressive than Roosevelt. New Freedom is more of a backwards-looking progressivism. New nationalism is more like accepting the changes we have now and moving forward and dealing with the specific problems of the companies or the corporations. So now we have a really interesting race. It is a four-way race, and it was intense. There are four candidates here. Now, Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, obviously he will campaign, and he wins a record amount of votes for the Socialist Party, but he didn't do very well. Why the hell socialist animal it is a lamb? I think it's just a PR thing, because socialist governments tend to be insanely oppressive and just notoriously terrible to their populations. Then you had Taft. Taft was the candidate of one of our two major parties, but he was no match for the other candidates. He had no place being in a four-way race that was very competitive, and his personality was just not up for it. And it was a little bit sad. At one point, one campaign stop, he was giving speeches, which everyone said he looked like he was half-assing it, because he really was. And he was giving a speech from the back of a train, and one of the journalists said, "Excuse me, Mr. President." Remember, he's the sitting president. "Mr. President, what do you think about what Mr. Roosevelt said about you recently?" Taft said, "I don't know. What did Roosevelt say about me?" And the reporter told him whatever terrible thing it was Roosevelt said, because Roosevelt could say some really mean things. Taft, 375-pound Taft, president of the United States, when he hears it, thinks about it for a minute, then sits down on the back of the train, puts his face in his hands, and just starts sobbing. All the journalists are sitting there like, "Oh my gosh, the president's sobbing." It was super awkward. So Taft, he had no business. But he is, of the four, he is the most conservative candidate, and he's not even that conservative. The main fight, the main attraction was Roosevelt versus Wilson. And they had some very good ways of criticizing each other. Roosevelt criticized Wilson because he said Wilson's backwards looking. He's going to undo all the progress that we've made and undo all the power of the United States. Which is true, that's what Wilson was wanting to do. Wilson, he had really good critiques of Roosevelt. He said Roosevelt wants to permanently expand the government, and then the government will oppress the population. And that's not an inaccurate statement. The government, if it grows too big, federal government, it historically has been the most oppressive thing of humans. You know, totally different kinds of government, like monarchies. Most governments in history are authoritarian. So, but it's not that Wilson's wrong about this. So there was, it was a fascinating race, and ultimately, because the Republicans were split, Wilson will win. Now, Wilson didn't get the majority of the popular vote, but in the Electoral College, where it matters, he won overwhelmingly. Had Roosevelt got the nomination, had the Republican Party had all primaries and Roosevelt got the nomination, he would definitely have won. Take a look. Eugene V. Debs, he won a record for the Socialist Party, more than 1 million votes. That is really good for the Socialist Party. The election of 1912 is significant for a lot of reasons, but three that we'll focus on. First and foremost, this shows you how impressive progressive movement, or how big the progressive movement was, and why progressivism will be so much more successful than the populist. Progressivism is a national movement. It's all over the country. Of the 4 candidates, the most conservative was Taft, and he wasn't even really conservative. He was progressive. But he is the most conservative. And most importantly, take a look at the popular vote. Roosevelt won 27.5% of the vote. Taft only won 23%. It is the only time in U.S. history a candidate of a major party lost to a third party. That's why the Progressive Party is, to this day, the most successful third party in U.S. history, because it's the only time a third party will win more votes than one of the 2 major parties. So that's the first thing. That shows you why progressives will get so much passed and why it's so popular. Second, the election of 1912 brought Southerners back into national politics. So during the period from Civil War up to FDR, we only have 2 Democrats, but the first one, Grover Cleveland, was a Northern Democrat. Wilson was a Southern Democrat, and he will bring a lot of Southerners into office with him, including William Jennings Bryan, who he makes his Secretary of State. But both houses of Congress will be controlled by Democrats, so Democrats will control the government. Democrats had always been very anti-government and very pro-laissez-faire until they gained control. And then once they gain control of the government, then they will go buck wild, and they will pass all sorts of stuff. That is generally true of parties. When people say they're anti-government, just wait till they get into the government, and then usually, I don't know of any cases where then they stick to that, except Calvin Coolidge, but we'll get to that. So Democrats regained control of the presidency and the federal government for the first time. So a lot of the progressive legislation that is passed during Wilson's first term is completely Southern-backed and controlled. And third, the Progressive Party changed the Republican Party. So the Republican Party, it was going a little bit more in the progressive direction. And then, because the progressives split, all the progressives in the Republicans will leave, and they are not welcome back. So the election in 1912, it reshapes the Republican Party to be even more conservative, which it will be intensely conservative when we get to the 1920s. So that is why the election of 1912 is so important and leads us into Wilson's first administration.